Yes, good morning. My name is Lou Lanzerotti. Um, my specialty in my field of research has been space physics and space plasma physics ever since I graduated with a PhD from Harvard University in 1965. I went to work at Bell Laboratories, AT&T Bell Laboratories at that time, to get involved with communication satellite program, to understand the space environment that communication satellites would be involved in, and to understand the environment itself. And the American Geophysical Union was the professional society that encouraged research and understanding in space, in the space phenomena that was just beginning to be open with the American space program at that time, less than 10 years after the launch of Sputnik. The AGU was as I said, the main professional society, and I became involved very early on, beginning to present papers at American Geophysical Union conferences, both in Washington and in San Francisco. I began building and being involved with AT&T Bell Laboratories spacecraft for communication purposes. I was involved with the first NASA AT&T Applications Technology Satellite 1, where we built instrumentation to measure the electron and proton environment at the geosynchronous altitude, which was becoming very important for communication satellites. And that's how I began my research in space physics and in geophysics, which has been fostered by my publications in AGU journals over the last 55 years or so. Over the years, with all the research that I was involved with, and including with collaborators across the nation and internationally as well, because of my background and my employment at Bell Laboratories, it was important that I make use of the information obtained, the scientific information obtained from my involvement with NASA programs and with AT&T spacecraft, in fact, to try to provide information back to the engineering side of AT&T and to the engineering community at large about the findings that we were making and the implications that they have for the design and understanding of impacts on terrestrial technologies, both in space and on the ground. In fact, there was a major cable outage for AT&T in 1972, which I was very much involved with understanding the reasons for that to be due to solar activity and the impacts on the Earth space environment. There was really no place to publish these kinds of engineering analyses that I did. There was no place to publish these engineering analyses that I did other than other professional societies. And so I have quite a lengthy set of papers from my results, non-scientific, but more engineering-oriented results in other professional societies' journals. And I do belong to these other professional societies, but the AGU has always been my home. And so it became clear to me that there should be some coupling between the pure science that basically the Journal of Geophysical Research was fostering very well indeed, and the implications and applications of this science. I believe that kind of understanding was also growing in the minds of the publication director of AGU at the time, Judy Holoviak, and was certainly growing in the mind of Fred Spillhouse, who was the executive director for so many fruitful and profitable years of AGU. I had known Fred Spillhouse for many, many years. We had met in 1967 on a bus for the IAGA meeting in St. Gallen, Switzerland. And we had had contacts over the years and that time. And I believe Fred Spillhouse and Judy Holoviak began to recognize and understand the need for a possible journal published by the AGU that would couple both the science and the applications of this important research area, which was growing even more important as time went on. I believe that the AGU formed a committee to look at the possibility of a journal of this nature. I had heard about the committee. I was not a member of it at all. However, after the AGU decided to explore the publication of such a journal, an AGU staff person in Judy Oloviak's office called me one day, and while I had just retired from Bell Laboratories, although I was still a consultant, this individual called me one day and asked me whether I would be, if I had known about the possibility of this journal beginning, and would I be considered as a possibility to be a possible editor or founding editor of the journal. I had been associate editor of JGR Space Physics over various times. I was a first associate in the first set of associate editors of the Geophysical Research Letters founded by Noel Henners back in 1974. So I knew the responsibilities of at least a co-editor and how much work it was. So I told the individual who called me from Judy's office that I would think it over because I was still quite heavily involved in research, and I had other things that I was doing as well. After some thought about this, we had further discussions and deliberations, and my thinking, I decided that, yes, let me try to be the founding editor and to get the journal started for the AGU. A journal that would couple the science activities of many AGU members with the applications that arose from them, heavily on the applications. The one thing that I insisted upon was that we were not going to duplicate the research in the Journal of Geophysical Research Space Physics. We did not want papers that were basically all science, but papers that had strong implications for engineering, for design, for mitigation of space problems and technology problems, and for forecasting. And so the journal began with that kind of a background that I brought. And the background that I brought, of course, was the 37 years that I had spent at Bell Laboratories, making a living and gaining my salary from the work that I had done in applying my research to engineering problems. I believe that having space weather under the umbrella of the American Geophysical Union provides the opportunity for the research that is published in JGR Space Physics to be seen by portions of the community and even non-members of AGU as important for their engineering and more practical applications. And thereby, using that kind of information, they have a place to publish in the AGU where other scientists can see the results of that research, and there can be this sort of circular coupling of science and applications and back to science again. The AGU, in terms of space weather, the AGU is unique in that regard, as far as I can determine, even at this stage, in having a publication that is applications oriented in the space field. Other professional societies do address issues of the engineering aspects of space phenomena, but they don't have the same kind of scientific background and scientific publication and credibility that AGU brings with its Journal of Geophysical Research Space Physics. So it's really a unique aspect of space weather and JGR Space Physics and the AGU. And that certainly has been very important for the community, I believe, and has widened the, excuse me, if I might say, it might be too much of a jump for me to say this, but I believe it has broadened the perspective of members of the AGU as to the importance of the research that they're carrying out. And I think one can see that today. The issues of space weather has continued to increase importance in the United States over the last 50 years that I've been involved in the activity, and certainly in the last 10 to 15 years. Just recently, President Trump signed the space weather legislation that was passed so unanimously in the House and the Senate. That had been in the works for some 5 or 6 years with a lot of changes and a lot of discussion. But finally, the nation has a much more strong emphasis and understanding of the importance of space weather for all of our national needs, from commercial to national security to scientific. That has really grown over the last 10, 15, 20 years of the length of time of the journal Space Weather. And I believe that that increase in interest and by the legislature and the executive office has been fostered to some extent, to a large extent, by members of the AGU who have seen the coupling and the relationship of their research to the practical side of their research, fostered by Space Weather Journal. I think that the journal, Space Weather Journal, does fit very well into the new strategic plan of the American Geophysical Union. And I believe it was a foresight of Fred Spillhouse and Judy Holoviak way back, like almost, not quite 20 years ago now, to see that that was an important direction that the union should be probably moving towards. And now the strategic plan sort of fulfills that in terms of all of AGU and not just space physics. When the Space Weather Journal was founded, it was founded both as a journal of scientific papers and the Space Weather Quarterly. The Space Weather Quarterly was a more popular version of space weather that fostered editorials, op-eds, and more popular level articles related to the space environment and engineering and science. And those hard copies were delivered to congressional offices on the Hill, as well as to the executive office. The Space Weather Quarterly has now become an all online publication. It's still open to everybody, but with the hard copies not delivered now, I'm not sure that its impact is quite the same as it was, say, a decade or so ago. And one needs to perhaps think about whether there's other ways or other ways to continue to alert the legislators to the issues that are raised by the Space Weather Journal. The quarterly was quite important because it is more widely read than the specific technical papers in the journal itself. And it still exists, and it's still quite a good publication, but not being hard copy means that there are people that are not professionals who are not accessing the quarterly, I believe. When Space Weather was started, the Space Weather Quarterly was totally open access, and with the quarterly hard copy delivered and distributed widely to members of AGU who requested it, as well as to legislative bodies and other entities, including the executive branch. The journal itself was not open access. It has recently become open access solely. In fact, I think the move towards open access, which was made quite substantially after I retired as the editor-in-chief, I think is a good move. It's a good move because it permits professionals in other societies who are more applications and engineering oriented to see the applications oriented papers that are resulting from AGU's scientific population and scientific papers. And so I think that's been a very, very good move for Space Weather to make that transition for its professional papers. I believe that the publication in this field of space plasma physics and space physics related to applications will continue to grow. It'll continue to grow slowly. I cannot say the percentage of that, but it'll continue to grow slowly because of several reasons. The nation has become much more cognizant of the importance of the research field and the applications, as can be seen by the legislation that has just passed the Congress and signed by the executive branch. And it can also be seen by the numbers, by the increase in the kinds of technologies that are potentially impacted by the solar terrestrial environment. Not just flying in space, but human exploration now, exploration of the moon as to coming about, and also technologies on the ground, radar, GPS, pipelines, cables, and such things. And so I think that the field will continue, the interest in the field of space plasma physics and the interest in the applications of the knowledge will continue to increase slowly, and will make the Space Weather Journal very important in the future going forward. The impacts of space phenomena, solar phenomena, and then the Earth's normal space environment on technologies very much differ depending upon the technology that one considers in the contemporary time. For example, in the Earth's equatorial region, there are plasma physics phenomena that happen independent of what the sun is doing. And those phenomena cause disturbances in the ionosphere. And so signals that come from satellites through the equatorial ionosphere to the ground, GPS signals or telecommunications signals, can be severely distorted at times for unknown reasons. Unknown because one doesn't really understand that region of the ionosphere very well. Well, one can say, well, that's the equatorial region, but that's a very important equatorial region for national security purposes, as well as for communication with those countries that lie in the equatorial band of the Earth. Similar phenomena can exist in the higher latitudes in the auroral region that can disturb radar signals and GPS signals as well. Then, of course, the thing that most people and many people are, I should say many people, and almost most people are interested in, then one of the things that most people are interested in is the effect of big disturbances on the sun. But the one that is a very big concern is when one has what is called a coronal mass ejection from a big solar flare region. This ejection of material from the sun can propagate to Earth and to cause extreme disturbances of the Earth's space environment. That disturbance of the Earth's space environment occurs not only where spacecraft fly, but also in the ionosphere. And the ionosphere at about 100 kilometers altitude can take on very large electrical currents. And those electrical currents can cause large disturbances on the surface of the Earth, including they can disturb electrical grid systems, for example. And several of those electrical grid systems have impacted population centers and power companies. There was an outage occurred throughout Quebec in 1989 from one of these coronal mass ejection events, where the entire province of Quebec was shut down because of the disturbances of the electrical currents in the ionosphere over the power grid in Quebec. The subsidiary effects from that event in 1989 was that as excess power was required by Quebec to be pulled through New Jersey and New York State up into Quebec, which caused the overloading and the burning out of a transformer plant, a big major transformer in a nuclear power plant in New Jersey at that time. The big disturbance like this in 1972 caused the outage of a cable, AT&T cable, communications cable from Chicago to San Francisco. And I was very much involved with the analysis of that particular event. Disturbances of the aurora can cause currents, anomalous electrical currents to flow in the pipelines in the northern hemisphere. And in fact, when the Alaska pipeline was installed, major research was implemented in order to try to mitigate and alleviate these excess currents from the Alaskan pipeline, in the Alaskan pipeline. Big solar events also can cause intense radio bursts from the sun. These radio bursts are in the high frequencies that correspond to GPS signals and wireless communication signals from cell phones, for example. These signals from the sun, independent of any coronal mass ejection or any other disturbance from the sun, can interfere or cause complete outages of GPS over a wide range of geographical latitude, including across the United States, which prevents navigation for several minutes, can be up to maybe 10 or 20 minutes during the length of time of these solar radio bursts. Solar activity can also produce very high energy charged particles, protons and electrons, which propagate from the sun, impact the Earth's magnetosphere, particularly in the polar regions, and greatly enhance the radiation in the polar regions, preventing aircraft from flying across the poles from the eastern United States, for example, to the Far East and vice versa. Airlines include in their weather forecasting centers the need for understanding the possibility of solar activity that could divert their airline flights across the poles. So there are many practical applications of understanding the solar environment, the solar terrestrial environment, the Earth space environment better and with more detail, with prediction and forecasting possibilities, as well as for design purposes. My interest in space weather and space physics and space plasma physics has continued since the time that I went from graduate school to employment in industry in AT&T Bell Laboratories. And my interest level has stayed about the same throughout that time, with more science and sometimes and more engineering at other times. One of the more interesting papers that I recall shepherding through the journal at the time was one having to do with national security during the time when the United States was very active in Afghanistan. There was a paper that went through many iterations, both classified and then finally classified, unclassified to the journal, and through the refereeing process that was related to national security and to an event that occurred in Afghanistan because of the impact of the ionosphere on GPS signals and on communication signals from satellites to the ground to American forces on the ground in Afghanistan at the time. This paper went through after it was declassified and after we came to the journal, went through a very rigorous process at the journal to make sure that there was nothing untoward in there in terms of national security prior to its publication. And finally, it did not have any implications of national security violations, and it was published, and I was very proud to shepherd it through. But it was a lot of work as well. But the implications and the understandings from the paper were very important, not only from national security purposes, but also from just the understanding of the effects of the Earth space environment on GPS and communication signals, particularly in those kinds of regions of the world. The importance of space weather is the coupling of science and applications. And it is I think the value that I brought to space weather was my background in industry, in having to couple my career and my yearly salary to my contributions to the company as well as to science itself. I said at one time and for a long time that I probably earned my entire lifetime salary from the contributions that I made to the understanding of the cable outage in 1972 from that large solar event. However, in industry and also in general, one's contributions fade with time, and that fading can be very short in terms of number of years and not for a lifetime. But I think that I brought to the journal this understanding of how important it is to couple science and applications where it was deemed feasible and where it was practicable and where it was not and where it was understandable. And so it's important that space weather, as the journal goes forward and as it has over the last 5, 6, 7 years since I stepped down, to maintain its rigor towards emphasizing the engineering aspects of the field and the applications aspects, and not to revert to another journal like Space Physics of JGR, and not to try to match JGR, but to make sure that the papers that are submitted and that are finally published are reviewed rigorously to see that they do have applicability to real world problems. And that's where I brought my background in industry to the journal, and I believe that it was a good thing. My advice for early career researchers would be similar to advice for more senior researchers, and that is to try to understand and to have not necessarily collaborations, but connections with the user communities that need information about space weather phenomena. It's easy in academia at times to have results that are very interesting and just throw them over a transom, so to speak, and hope that somebody interested in the applications will pick it up and run with it. That is insufficient. And for a younger early career researcher, it's important to understand that just throwing results, scientific results, over a transom, hoping that somebody somewhere, some user, will make use of it, is not sufficient. It's important to have some type of connection, collaboration, and insights into the real needs of a user and an operator and a developer and a designer. And those kind of connections are not always easy to make, and they're not always easy to sustain either. But that's some advice that I think an early career person could profit from. In closing, I think I would just like to emphasize that I believe that the foresight that AGU had in thinking about a journal, in sensing that there was an area out there of applications of some element of AGU's research that could be very important for the Union, in fostering the coupling and the interrelationship of its science and its applications. That foresight that was brought by the leadership at that time, I think, was very, very insightful, which resulted in space weather and now is incorporated into the strategy plan of the AGU. And I think that speaks very well of the American Geophysical Union and its insight to directions of research and engineering in the United States. And I see that continuing into the future. And I'm very, very happy for AGU. And I'm very, very, very taken with the fact that the union has this foresight to move forward in this direction.